just given by the senator from Alaska, and I yield the floor.
From New Hampshire.
Madam President, I'm really pleased to join Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Murkowski on the floor of the Senate today, and I want to sign up for the Get It Done caucus because I think this is legislation that we can get done. It has support from bipartisan support from, I believe, the majority of the members in this Senate, and I think if we can get some agreement to move forward on this legislation and on the amendments, that we can really show the public, who is very frustrated with what's happening here in Washington, that we can actually get something done. And I want to thank Senator Wyden and Senator Murkowski for all of their great work on the Energy Committee. I had the opportunity to serve my first 4 years on the Energy Committee. And it's a great committee, and they have done a terrific job of showing what it's like to be able to get things done, to be able to get people to come together, figure out where they can get agreement, and move forward. And it was in that spirit that Senator Portman and I started working 3 years ago when we were both members of the Energy Committee on energy efficiency legislation, working with the Alliance to Save Energy and a number of members of the business community, of all of these groups that have endorsed this legislation to try and put together a bill where we could find some agreement. And there's been a lot of division around energy issues in the last decade or so. That's why it's been, I think, 6 years, actually, since 2007, since an energy bill has come to the floor of the Senate, because there are those of us who believe that the best way forward is to focus on fossil fuels and more oil and gas. There are others who believe alternatives and renewables, hydro and solar and wind, are the best way forward. But one of the things that's true in this entire energy debate, whether you come from North Dakota, as the presiding officer does, or New Hampshire, as I do, is that energy efficiency is something that benefits all of us. And it doesn't matter which form of energy you support or which region of the country you're from. This is a place where we can really get some consensus. And it's agreement that allows us to move forward on job creation. It allows us to move forward on saving on pollution. We've had several senators to the floor in the last couple of days to talk about the challenges of climate change and what's happening with our weather. This is a way to save on those emissions. It's a way to address cost savings. I've been to businesses all over New Hampshire that have been able to stay competitive because they've reduced their energy costs. And in a state like New Hampshire, where we have the 6th highest energy costs in the country, it's important for us to figure out how we can lower those costs. That's one of the things this bill does. The other thing it does that we haven't talked as much about on the floor is that it reduces our dependence on foreign oil and foreign sources of energy. So it's also critical to our national security. As we think about our energy challenges in the future, making sure that we can produce the energy that we use in the United States is very important as we think about what's happening in the Middle East, as we think about the challenges that we have to stay competitive in the world. Energy, as Senator Murkowski said so well, is something that affects everything we do. Now, this bill has been criticized by some quarters for not being robust enough. And I appreciate that there are things that are in the legislation that I might not have chosen to put in. There are things that I would like to have seen in it that we didn't get consensus on. But I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about how do we reach consensus on a bipartisan bill, how do we get something done that can get through not only the Senate but the House. And I think we've got a good start in this legislation. The bill would do several things. First, it would strengthen national model building codes to make new homes and commercial buildings more energy efficient. And we know that about 40% of our energy use in this country is used in buildings. So making sure that those buildings are more energy efficient is critical. It's particularly important for those of us who are in the Northeast. In New Hampshire, we have a lot of old buildings because we're an older part of the country, and so we have a lot of buildings that have been there for a long time. We need to do what we can to make them more energy efficient. Then the legislation would also train the next generation of workers in energy-efficient commercial building design and operation. It would expand on university-based building training and research assessment centers, something that is very important as we think about the future workforce. And let me just go back, because when I talked about the national model building codes, I want to make sure that everybody's clear that these building codes are voluntary. They are not mandatory. As Senator Portman has said so well, there are no mandates in this legislation. This is an effort to look at incentives, to look at how we can encourage the private sector and consumers to be more energy efficient. Then the bill also deals with the manufacturing sector, which is the biggest user of energy in our economy. It directs the Department of Energy to work closely with private sector partners to encourage research, development, and commercialization of innovative energy-efficient technology and processes for industrial applications. So that's a mouthful, but what it really says is, and this is something that we heard from stakeholders from those businesses that work in the energy industry, that is that they wanted to have a better working relationship with the Department of Energy. They wanted to be able to feel like there was support there as they're trying to take technologies to commercialization. It also helps manufacturers reduce energy use and become more competitive by incentivizing the use of more energy-efficient electric motors and transformers. You know, about 4% of the energy used in this country is through electric motors and transformers. I've been interested in transformers because we have a company in New Hampshire called Warner Power that has made the first breakthrough in transformer design in 100 years. And if we could get their energy-efficient transformers or something like them into buildings and projects across the country, we could save significant amounts of energy. Then, as we look at the manufacturing sector, the other thing the legislation does is establish a program called Supply Star to help make companies look at their supply chains and figure out how to make their supply chains more efficient. I can remember when I was on the Energy Committee and we were talking about this whole issue of supply chains, and we were debating whether it was important to encourage companies to look at their supply chains, and people were saying, well, it doesn't really make that much difference in terms of the actual energy use. And I pointed out that we've got a company in New Hampshire called Stonyfield Farms that makes yogurt. Great yogurt. If you haven't had it, you should really try it. But they've been very interested in being more energy efficient. They've looked at all of their processes. They've figured out how they can do the best possible job at saving on energy. And what they discovered was that their biggest problem wasn't how they produced the yogurt. It was the cows that they depended upon for the milk to produce the yogurt, because those cows release so much methane that was really the problem in terms of their supply chain with the amount of energy they were producing. So helping companies take a look at their supply chain and figure out how to reduce the energy through that supply chain is very important, and it's an important piece of this bill. Then the third section in the legislation deals with the federal government. And I know all of us know this because we're here and we're working hard on energy. But the federal government is the biggest user of energy in this country. Most of that energy is used by the military. About 93% is used by the military. And the military's figured out that it's important for them to figure out how to be more energy efficient. They've been real leaders, I think, in government, the Navy in particular, but all branches of the military have looked at how they can be more efficient in using energy. And our legislation tries to incentivize the rest of the government to catch up with the military. So we would ask agencies to look at data centers, and we have some very good amendments from Senators Risch and Udall and Senator Coburn to take a look at data centers because they're a big waster of energy in the federal government. It would allow federal agencies to use existing funds to update plans when they're doing new buildings so that they make those more energy efficient. And we've got a number of amendments that would also address how we can make the federal government more energy efficient and be a leader as we look at what's happening in the private sector to save on energy. So this bill is a very good start with how to address energy efficiency. And Senators Murkowski and Wyden have said we've got over a dozen agreed to bipartisan amendments that would make the bill even better. I hope we can get to those amendments. I think it's really important for us to do this. But to answer those people who say this is just a little bill, it's not going to make much difference, I would point to a new study that just came out from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. They looked at this legislation without the amendments, and the amendments are going to make it better. But they said that if we can pass this legislation, that by 2025, the legislation will encourage the creation of 136,000 new jobs, not just in businesses that are going to be more efficient and so they can create more jobs, but in businesses that are producing the energy efficient technologies that are going to allow us to be more energy efficient. By 2030, the bill would net an annual savings of over $13 billion to consumers, and it would lower carbon dioxide emissions and other air pollutants by the equivalent of taking 22 million cars off the road. That's a pretty good savings in pollution. So, as we've all said, this is a win-win-win. It makes sense for us to move on this legislation. It makes sense for what we can accomplish with the legislation itself. It makes sense in terms of the other energy issues that are pending and what we need to do to make sure we position the United States and our businesses and our families to be more energy efficient, to be able to compete in the new energy world that we're entering. We need to start now to address energy, and I hope that we're going to be able to get by the impediments that currently face us so we can begin to vote, so we can adopt the great amendments that have been proposed, and so we can actually act on this bill. Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm pleased to see my partner on this legislation here on the floor to talk about why we need to pass this.
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, I appreciate Senator from New Hampshire's comments on the important benefits of this legislation, and I would just start by saying I think we're pretty close to figuring out a way to move forward if we can get both the majority and the minority party leadership teams to look at the list. We've got about a dozen bipartisan amendments that we're ready to go on. In fact, more than half those amendments have already been discussed at some length on the floor, so the time agreement could be relatively narrow, I think. And we can move quickly. Some of them could be voice voted. And then we've got some amendments that are not directly related to energy efficiency, but related to energy. I would hope we could take those up as well. My understanding is there's been a general agreement to have a vote on the Vitter amendment. That's something that I've heard on the floor from leadership. And then we've also got a Keystone amendment that I think there's an agreement to move forward on that relates to energy more broadly, and one where I think this body has a strong interest in expressing itself. So I would hope we could figure out how to move forward on this and do it quickly. We're wasting time right now. You know, we've spent the last couple of days on the floor again talking about all these amendments. So if the concern's about time, let's get going, because we can process these amendments quickly. And I appreciate the fact that the majority leader is working with us on this. He's keeping the door open, and so we're going back and forth. And I really do believe that this is a seminal moment in the sense that if we can't even do a bipartisan bill like this on energy efficiency that came out of the committee with a 19-3 vote, what can we do? It's an important piece of legislation. It's not a major piece of legislation like the continuing resolution or the debt limit or tax reform or entitlement reform, things that this body knows it has to address. But it is a step forward, and I think it would provide a model for how we can move forward on other issues. We've spent 2.5 years working on this legislation. We have been able to garner the support of over 260 businesses, trade associations, who believe this is good legislation for our country. That's one reason we got a 19-3 vote out of committee. That's one reason there's a lot of support on the floor for this underlying bill. It's ultimately about having a smart energy strategy. I believe that we should produce more energy here in the country, particularly in the ground, in America right now. I think that's good for our economy and our country. We should also use it more efficiently. And this is an opportunity to have a true all-of-the-above strategy, in this case, energy efficiency, going along with production and other important elements of an energy strategy that make sense. So I hope that we'll be able to make progress on this today and move forward and start to have some votes on these good amendments that actually improve the legislation, in my view. The jobs issue here is also one that's paramount. I mean, you think about it, there's a report out that my colleague from New Hampshire talked about that says there'll be 136,000 additional jobs created by this legislation by 2030. I think that's a lowball estimate because there will be jobs created in energy efficiency, in other words, by encouraging, not through mandates, because there are no mandates in this legislation, except on the federal government, to get them to practice what they preach, as we talked about yesterday. But by encouragement and incentives, there'll be more jobs created in the energy efficiency field. That's good for our economy. More significantly to me, there will be jobs created because American businesses will be more competitive. They will be able to spend less on energy and more on expanding plant and equipment and people, and they'll be hiring more people as they level the playing field, in essence, on one of the essential costs of doing business, which is your energy costs. And we need that right now. Our economy is weak. We have not had the recovery that all of us hoped for. They say it's the weakest economic recovery we've lived through since the Great Depression. We simply need to have that shot in the arm. This is one way to do it. It's not the only way to do it, but it would certainly help. And then finally, it's going to help our economy in ways that are important. Right now, we have a trade deficit, and it's driven by a couple of things. One is China, the other is energy. Taking those two out, it would be almost an even balance of payments. Now, that trade deficit is driven in part by the fact that we have this demand still for a lot of foreign energy. And by making these relatively small but important steps in energy efficiency, we actually will reduce our dependency on foreign sources of energy. As I said earlier, I think we should produce more energy in this country. That's part of the answer. But part of it is also using it more efficiently, using it more wisely, which I believe is a conservative value, and it also happens to help on the trade deficit and therefore will help our underlying economy. So these are all positive aspects of this legislation that I would think that members on both sides of the aisle acknowledge, and if we can't move forward again on something that makes so much sense and that does have that kind of support across the aisle, I worry about whether we can deal with these bigger issues that we must for the American people. It also, of course, leads to a cleaner environment. Why? Because you're having to build fewer power plants, and through efficiency you're going to have fewer emissions. This is why you have groups from the Chamber of Commerce, which is key voting this legislation, by the way, to groups on the environmental side saying, you know, this is good legislation. It makes sense. Strange bedfellows when you have the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups with environmental groups like the National Resources Defense Council saying, this makes sense, let's move forward with it. So I'm hopeful we can move forward not just on resolving these differences on what amendments can be offered and voted on, but also move forward on this underlying bill, send it to the House where there's interest in this bill, where there is, on both sides of the aisle, an interest in taking up efficiency legislation, and then send it to the President for a signature, and actually be able to go home and say, you know what, we did something here to help create jobs, grow the economy, have a cleaner environment, deal with our trade deficit, and again, create a model for how other issues can be resolved. For members who are listening and haven't come to the floor yet to talk about their amendments, hope they'll do that. because we may have a relatively narrow window now because of the fact that we are spending so much time trying to resolve these differences on which amendments can get a vote. I'm hopeful that we'll have the opportunity to start voting today yet. If we do, we can move quickly, and we can dispose of these issues. And by the way, some of the issues are not directly related to energy efficiency. If they don't come up on this bill, they're going to come up on another bill. So better in my estimation for us to go ahead and have some of these debates, have some of these discussions, go ahead and see the votes. And again, they should be subject to time limitations. We should have a reasonable list. We think we've got a reasonable list now going back and forth, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to resolve that. But in the meantime, if members can come down and talk about their amendments, that would be very helpful for us to ensure that we can get to the underlying bill and move forward on this. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member because they have been working very closely with us, not just for the last 2.5 years, to put together legislation that has this broad support, but more recently they've been helping Senator Shaheen and myself to ensure that we do have, on both sides of the aisle, good lines of communication and the ability to move forward with an energy bill. For them, they care about efficiency. I'll let them speak for themselves, but they have done that ably earlier today. But they also care about an energy agenda for our country, and they view this as one of the first major pieces of energy legislation that can lead then to other bills. And for those who would like to discuss broader energy topics but wouldn't have the ability to do it on this legislation, or maybe don't have their amendments fully formed on that, the commitment from the chair and ranking member is they're going to have additional energy legislation. I serve on the committee. I can tell you I have a strong interest in moving forward on some of the fossil fuel legislation, for instance, and they've made a commitment to do that. So there will be other opportunities where we'll have broader energy legislation that deals with the production side, deals with the important part of our energy strategy in addition to energy efficiency that lets us truly have an all-of-the-above energy strategy. And I thank them for that commitment and for their strong work on this legislation. Once we move this, it's much easier then to see us move forward on these other bills. Success begets success. And with that, Madam President, I'm hopeful that, again, members will come to the floor, talk about their amendments. I see one of my colleagues coming to the floor now, and that we can move forward with a good discussion on energy issues and move to these amendments as soon as possible and then move to final passage. I yield back my time.
Senator from Arkansas.
Madam President, I have 12 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They've been approved by the majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I want to thank my two colleagues from New Hampshire and Ohio for their leadership, and of course my colleagues from Alaska and Oregon as well for their leadership on this very important piece of legislation. I have 4 amendments that I would love to be considered. I'd love to be included in the legislation, and I hope that we're able to move these forward. But let me just talk about 2 of those, Madam President. And I don't want to take the Senate's time. I understand other senators may be on their way over to the floor to speak. But let me first, Madam President, start with the quadrennial energy review. This is something that I've worked with the senator from Alaska on and many others in this chamber. In fact, we have, it's a bipartisan amendment. It's Amendment 1881, and our co-sponsors are Senators Alexander, Begich, Bozeman, Coons, Heinrich, Tester, Tom Udall, and Senator Wyden. And again, bipartisan group of senators. Basically, one of the things we've learned from the Department of Defense is every 4 years they do a quadrennial defense review, and that helps them determine what's going on within their agency as an agency. It helps them determine the strengths and weaknesses, the needs, the things that need to be addressed. It helps them plan, and it also helps us make decisions. We want to make good defense decisions, and the only way you do that is by knowing what you have on hand and what you need. Well, this is the same for energy. We have a lot of very well-intentioned energy programs and ideas that either float around this Capitol building or float around the various departments or that are law right now, and a lot of these programs exist. But these aren't necessarily coordinated. There's no one there that's really making sure that all of the dots connect and that we're able to have a smart energy policy. So I feel like a quadrennial energy review, every 4 years we would go federal government top to bottom, look at all of our energy needs, look at our capabilities, look at our shortcomings, look at where we focus our resources. Should we be doing research in one area, and should we be focusing on manufacturing somewhere else? But this will allow us to have a good, solid review every 4 years so that we can make good decisions, so the various departments can make good decisions, and also it'll help industry know kind of what's coming down the pike. It'll help bring things together and coordinate in a very positive and constructive way. So the quadrennial energy review, from my standpoint, is a very important piece and building block. It's laying the foundation for having a smart energy policy for this country. And that's one thing that we need to recognize, quite honestly, here in the Senate, is that, again, we have good intentions, but we don't always have a cohesive and smart energy policy. So the QER is something that I would hope that we would be able to get through on this legislation and get this legislation moving through the process. Let me just give you one example, Madam President, on the quadrennial energy review. We have in our country now a lot more domestic energy than we've had in years past. It's very exciting. And in my state, we produce a lot of natural gas through horizontal drilling and fracking, et cetera. And that's common in many other states around the country. I know that I see some senators here where they have the same thing. Sometimes it's oil, sometimes it's gas, sometimes it's both. Well, let's just take natural gas for one moment. We have people come into my office and they'll say, hey, this is great that we have all this natural gas now. Why don't we liquefy it and export it? Okay, well, you know, it's an idea. We ought to talk about that and think about that. Or they'll come in, or another group will come in and say, hey, we have all this natural gas. Why don't we actually turn it into diesel fuel? Well, okay, apparently you can do that. Technology's there. All right, well, let's talk about that. Then we have other folks that come to us and they say, why don't we take this natural gas and let's convert our diesel fleet over to natural gas. Well, here again, okay, that does all sounds good, but I don't think you can do all three of those things. And we don't have any mechanism right now to coordinate that and put all that together and get consistent with our energy policy.
Would the Senator yield for a question?
Absolutely.
It strikes me that the Senator's idea is particularly practical right now because you look at the changes we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly in areas like natural gas. And we were talking about it with the senators from North Dakota. 4 or 5 years ago, and this would be the point of the Senator's amendment, to get the policies of the government to start being reflective of what goes on in the marketplace. 4 or 5 years ago in our state, we were having pitched battles about whether to develop import facilities for natural gas. And they were pretty spirited discussions. People were getting hauled out by the gendarmes and all that. Now we're having the same kind of battles over whether we ought to build export facilities. Is that the Senator's desire to make sure that the government and the policies of the government sort of keep up with the times? Because it strikes me that the Senator from Alexander is proposing, the Senator from Arkansas is proposing an amendment that's particularly timely right now.
That's exactly right. And I want to thank the Senator from Oregon for his good question, because that's exactly right. We need something, some mechanism to make sure that we're consistent and coherent and cohesive in our energy policy in the country, and things change. And that's why you want to do this about every 4 years. You don't need to do it every year. I mean, it's just too much work and too much going on. But just like the Department of Defense, things change, and what happens is you get a benchmark from 4 years ago that suddenly you have a good comparison. You have a baseline that you can look back to 4 years ago and see if you're making progress, see if your policy's going in the right direction, see, you know, in this case, maybe we have a lot of energy programs that aren't working very well. Well, this will help us identify those. Maybe we have some that are working great we ought to be spending more money on. This will help us identify those. And I do want to thank the Senator for his question. I see that we have other senators coming to the floor, but Madam President, let me talk just very quickly about one other bill, one other amendment I have. Is the voluntary certification program, and here again, bipartisan, working with Senator Sessions on this. It's Amendment 1879. This is a very specific amendment for some very specific industries. heating, cooling, commercial refrigeration, and water heating products. So this is not an economy-wide thing. This is very specific to those industries. But right now what they do is they self-certify. They self-certify, and I think they should be allowed to continue to do that, assuming that their certification meets certain credible and scientific standards, which I think they do now, and if they don't now, they should. But what this will do is this actually save the government money. There's no reason why the Department of Energy and others should be reviewing this and making them do extra certification and more testing, et cetera, when it's already being done right now to the standards that everyone should accept. So, Madam President, with that, I could talk more about this, but I do see that I have a couple of colleagues here on the floor that would, my understanding, would like to speak. So, Madam President, with that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I hope we are moving to votes on this bill, to votes on our no Washington exemption language. So I certainly continue to encourage that and continue to support that. And the reason that's important, particularly on this no Washington exemption language, is because unless we act on October 1st, what I think is a completely illegal rule from the Obama administration that does create a special Washington exemption will go into effect. And, Madam President, first of all, I think it's very, very unfortunate, sure is frustrating, that I and others have to be here on the floor blocking an illegal rule in the first place. Because, you see, on this point, Obamacare is clear. The actual statutory language of Obamacare says clearly that all members of Congress and their congressional staff go to the exchange. It's crystal clear about that, all of us. And in another section, Section 1512, it also says clear that any folks going to the exchange, they lose their employer-based subsidy. That is crystal clear. Chuck Grassley, our distinguished colleague, authored this provision, and he couldn't have been more clear about where he was coming from, about the intent. He said at the time, quote, "The more that Congress experiences the laws it passes, the better," close quote. He's exactly right. That's what this is all about. That's what that provision is all about. And legal experts like David Ermer, a lawyer who's represented insurers, including in the federal employee program for 30 years, said clearly, quote, "I don't think members of Congress and their staff can get funds for coverage in the exchanges under existing law," close quote. That is very, very clear, particularly from the precise language of the Obamacare statute. So it's pretty darn frustrating that my colleagues and I who are pushing this no Washington exemption language have to be here doing this to begin with. It's all because of an illegal rule to bail out Congress, to create out of thin air a Washington exemption that will go into effect unless we act October 1st. So that's why we must act. That's why we must vote in a timely way. Now, this illegal rule, the first thing it says is we don't know what staff are covered or not, so we're going to leave it up to each individual member of Congress to even decide what, if any, of their staff have to go to the exchange. Now, Madam President, that is a ludicrous interpretation of the clear statutory language. It's ludicrous on its face because that language says all official staff. Secondly, and even more outrageous in my opinion, this illegal rule says whoever does go to the exchange from Congress, from staff, gets this very, very generous taxpayer-funded subsidy transferred from the Federal Employee Health Benefits Plan, which we're leaving, to the exchange. Well, where did that come from? That's not in Obamacare. In fact, Section 1512 of Obamacare says exactly the opposite with regard to all employer-based contributions. So where did that come come from. It came out of thin air, and it came out of intense lobbying to have President Obama create this special Washington exemption. And so I urge all of my colleagues to do the right thing and say, you know what, the first most basic rule of democracy is that we should be treated the same as America under the laws we pass. And that should be true across the board, certainly including Obamacare. Madam President, that's why the Heritage Foundation recently said, quote, Obama's action to benefit the political class is the latest example of this administration doing whatever it wants, regardless of whether it has the authority to do so. The Office of Personnel Management overstepped its authority when it carried out the President's request to exempt Congress from the requirements of the health care law. Changing laws is the responsibility of the legislative branch, not the executive, quote. And they also said, quote, millions of Americans are going to be losing their existing coverage and paying more for health insurance. Under the Vitter Amendment, so would the Obama administration's appointees, Congress, and congressional staff. They baked that cake. Now they can eat it too, close quote. Similarly, National Review said recently, quote, most employment lawyers interpreted that, meaning the Obamacare language, to mean that the taxpayer-funded federal health insurance subsidies dispensed to those on Congress's payroll, which now range from $5,000 to $11,000 a year, would have to end. And a little later, in the same opinion piece they wrote, under behind-the-scenes pressure from members of Congress in both parties, President Obama used the quiet of the August recess to personally order the Office of Personnel Management, which supervises federal employment issues, to interpret the law so as to retain the generous congressional benefits, close quote. Wall Street Journal has also weighed in. I think they're right. Quote, the issue is the White House's recent Obamacare bailout for members of Congress and their staffs. If Republicans want to show that they stand for something, this is it. If they really are willing to do whatever it takes to oppose this law, there should be no more meaningful way to prove it, close quote. As I said, the author of this original provision of Obamacare made it perfectly clear where he was coming from. That's our distinguished colleague Chuck Grassley. Quote, the more that Congress experiences the laws it passes, the better, close quote. And the distinguished lawyer regarding this area of law, David Ermer, also said it's clear, quote, I don't think members of Congress and their staff can get funds for coverage in the exchanges under existing law, close quote. So, Madam President, that's why we have to act and have to vote before October 1st. Finally, in closing, let me just say I want to be very direct and ask members and the public to beware of another approach to defeating this no Washington exemption language. And that approach is pretty clever and it's pretty cynical. And that approach is to say, oh, this is a great idea, but we actually need to expand this to all federal employees. And there are members promoting this approach, particularly on the Republican side. Madam President, that will have one effect and one effect only. It will help ensure absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts that my language doesn't pass or that language doesn't pass. In fact, one of the main Republican proponents of this language said in a meeting which I attended, this will be perfect because under that scenario, under that language, all Republicans can vote yes, all Democrats will vote no, and it'll be killed and we'll keep the subsidy. So that's the game. That's the point. That's what's going on. We need a straight up or down vote on this no Washington exemption language, which is filed as an amendment to this bill on the floor, which is filed as a separate bill. And I very much look forward to that before October 1st. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, there's an epidemic of abuse that is taking place in America today. Recent reports estimate that hundreds of thousands of children and youth are at risk of domestic sex trafficking. Individuals on the front lines in the fight against domestic sexual trafficking of children report that instances are on the rise. They tell us that former drug dealers have moved on to sex trafficking. They also tell us that technological advances have made this type of trafficking easier as smartphones and other devices provide distance and increased levels of anonymity. And certain websites that post classified ads soliciting sexual partners also help facilitate trafficking. The risk of sex trafficking is compounded every year for up to 30,000 young people who are, quote, emancipated, unquote, from foster care. Too many of these emancipated youth turn 18, pack their few belongings in a trash bag, and are driven to the homeless shelter, leaving them vulnerable and exposed to trafficker and other predators. While in foster care, children and youth are also at increased risk for trafficking. In July of this year, the FBI's Innocence Lost initiative, which combats domestic sex trafficking of minors, launched Operation Cross Country, a 3-day effort to recover child victims of sex trafficking. Operation Cross Country recovered 105 children and arrested 152 traffickers. The efforts of the Innocence Lost initiative and the results of Operation Cross Country are laudable. However, they also revealed a disturbing element of our nation's child welfare and foster care systems. According to some reports, up to 60% of sexually exploited children are recruited out of the child welfare and foster care systems. That's an unbelievable statistic, but it's apparently true. Because of the trauma and past abuse suffered by children and youth in these systems, they are particularly vulnerable to traffickers. FBI officials involved in Operation Cross Country report that, quote, law enforcement refers to these young victims as children with a void. Once the pimp identifies that void and makes every attempt to fill it, a dependency between the child and the perpetrator develops, unquote. Law enforcement officials also report that, quote, the most vulnerable victims forced into sex trafficking range in age from 13 to 16. Most of the children come from either foster care homes or are considered runaways, unquote. In order to combat domestic sex trafficking and improve outcomes for children and youth in foster care, systemic changes need to be made in the current child welfare system. Therefore, Madam President, today I'm introducing the Improving Outcomes for Youth at Risk for Sex Trafficking Act of 2013. The short title of the bill is I Owe Youth. Mr. President, we do owe these youth. These are our country's most damaged and most vulnerable children. And yet most kids who age out of foster care face negative outcomes such as homelessness, teen pregnancy, drug addiction, and trafficking. We owe them better. This legislation I'm introducing today addresses some of the widespread conditions in the child welfare and foster care systems that make these children and youth particularly vulnerable to being sexually trafficked. I'm sure many Americans would be surprised to learn that most child welfare agencies will not serve trafficked children and youth who are not in the custody of a biological or foster family or living in a group home. Often these children who are not legally able to give consent for sex are arrested for prostitution and referred to the juvenile justice system. In many states, the courts and the juvenile justice system are ill-equipped to deal with the trauma these children and youth have endured. My bill requires that states provide services to youth who have been trafficked or who are at risk of being trafficked. The bill also redirects resources to improve the current court system to better identify and address the needs of trafficked youth. Many youth in foster care are routinely denied the opportunity to participate in normal age-appropriate activities and social events, such as playing sports, participating in after-school activities, and enjoying social life with friends. This lack of contact and engagement in healthy and meaningful activities deprives young people of important social connections. Preventing youth from having normal experiences impairs their healthy development and contributes to isolation and loneliness, which in turn makes them vulnerable to domestic sex trafficking. Also homelessness, drug abuse, poor educational outcomes, poverty, and of course other negative outcomes. My bill includes a number of provisions to encourage, enhance, and support youth in foster care and to facilitate their participation in age-appropriate activities and social events. I hope these provisions will promote healthy development, increase opportunities to form meaningful connections, and reduce the risk of vulnerability to domestic sex trafficking and other negative outcomes. Madam President, another major risk factor for vulnerability to domestic sex trafficking and other negative outcomes for older youth in care is a continued reliance on congregate care facilities. These facilities are routinely targeted by traffickers and are often warehouses for youth who are rarely, if ever, allowed to engage in healthy, age-appropriate activities and social events. I understand that many of the children and youth in foster care are deeply traumatized and presented with many acute physical and mental conditions. Some of these children and youth need intensive treatment to help them to manage or overcome these conditions. I am pleased to report that there are many good providers who are doing the work who support the legislation I am introducing today. IO Youth refocuses federal priorities of connecting vulnerable youth with caring permanent families. For those remaining in congregate care facilities, my legislation requires that youth have improved access to normal, age-appropriate activities. Madam President, youth in foster care report that they feel uninvolved, unaware, and disconnected to any planning around their care or their future. They are not informed of their rights while in foster care. This can lead to a sense of disenfranchisement and a lack of connection to siblings, relatives, or other caring adults. In many cases, this lack of connection contributes to the void so often preyed upon by traffickers. My bill requires that state child welfare agencies provide ongoing family finding for older youth in foster care. IO Youth, this bill, also requires greater participation of youth in planning for their future and encourages states to find individuals willing to be involved in an ongoing basis with the youth in foster care. Individuals who work with victims of domestic sex trafficking tell us that the single biggest challenge to successful intervention with these victims is a lack of accessible and affordable housing. For older youth who have been emancipated from foster care, not having a place to sleep is often a reason why they enter into the sex trade. In order to improve housing options for these at-risk youth, my bill redirects funds from the Social Services Block Grant in order to provide housing to trafficked and other vulnerable youth. Madam President, we live in very contentious times. There are fierce policy and partisan divides on many critical issues. Domestic sex trafficking of children and youth from foster care is not one of those issues. If there is any issue under the sun that is without controversy, it is this one. Last June, the Senate Finance Committee heard from a courageous survivor of domestic sex trafficking. She told us that she had been sold, quote, to several other pimps that had sex with me and forced me to have sex with other men. My story is sad, but it's common, and girls like me are all around, but people don't see them, so they remain victims, unquote. This young lady went on to change her life and hold a regular job and to testify against some of these so-called pimps. What a courageous young woman. It's time for us to pay attention to these girls and to all the children and youth in the foster care system. I expect my legislation to have broad, bipartisan support in the Senate. I am pleased that a number of organizations already support the bill, And I'm particularly gratified that organizations that work directly with young people have come out so strongly in support of my legislation. I have received letters of support from IO Youth, or for IO Youth, from Foster Club, Children's Home Society of America, the National Network for Youth, the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare, Covenant House International, Rights for Girls, the Children's Village, National Children's Alliance, and the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I am hopeful that the Senate can come together to act quickly on my legislation. We owe these youths that much. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The American people that it was not. It was a spontaneous eruption of a demonstration. Let me move on. Why must, you're a manager, again, you're a manager, so you can get things done. You're at a high level. Why must this committee transcribe? This is an email to you. It's not an email form. Why must we transcribe all the information that we get? Why can't we get it and get copies of it? We'll make the copies of it. Why can't we? Why must we subpoena it? Why aren't you forthcoming? You personally.
The chairman has already.
I'm asking you.
The chairman has already posed that question, and I've taken the question.
And what was your answer? What are you doing about it?
I'm taking the question back to the State Department, sir.
But you're in a position of managing. What are you going to do? Instead of taking the question, what are you going to do to answer it right now?
I'm telling you, sir, that I'm taking the question.
Listen. I don't want to point fingers, and it's been alleged here. I'm not here to point fingers, but I think it's abundantly clear after a year to the American people what's happening here. This administration and your department in particular are stonewalling. They don't want to give up the information. They have been doing that since this began. They actively misled at the time and continue to mislead now regarding the facts. We just want the fact. It's apparent that the information that came out regarding the talking points did not comport with the President's narrative, did not comport with the President's narrative in election time, with a President election looming, and so they had to be changed. That is apparent. It is also apparent that the administration continues to hide this fact from the American people. And with regard to Foreign Service officers, it's apparent that if that happens again, and it does not fit with the President's narrative, they will be left to be killed, sodomized, and have their bloody bodies dragged through the streets for all the world to see, instead of having this administration find out what really happened. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Yes.
Sir, I have been a Foreign Service officer for 40 years. We do everything we can, as I've outlined here, to attempt to mitigate the risk to our personnel overseas. But being a diplomat is an inherently risky activity. I cannot, nor can any of my colleagues, nor can I believe that anyone can end that risk. We do everything we can to mitigate that risk, but we cannot end the risk.
We're going to Mr. Trey Radel from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you tell me about we know that the 4 people are relieved of their senior positions. They essentially get reassigned somewhere else. Can you tell me what, you got Ray, Eric, Scott, Charlene, who are the 4 here. What are they doing today?
One of them has been reassigned to a lower level position in the Bureau of African Affairs. One is the director of the Office of Foreign Missions, and the other 2 are in the process of being reassigned to positions of lesser responsibility with no worldwide purview.
So these undoubtedly, unquestionably, are not higher seniority levels, but correct?
They have been reassigned to positions of lesser responsibility, yes, sir.
Lesser responsibility. Okay.
And it's
quickly with Mr. Raymond Maxwell. Why? I don't understand why he gets put on administrative leave when his duties do not include any review, approval, or even formations of recommendations regarding security resources in Libya. Why is this? How does this guy fit in?
Mr. Maxwell was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, responsible for the Maghreb, meaning the band of countries across the North African littoral, including Libya. That Libya was within his purview as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Maghreb.
So I think you'd agree with me that, look, all of us here, regardless of what side of the aisle we're on, we know that it's important to learn from our mistakes. Part of the improvements that we in this committee have done, we passed some legislation. I worked with Congresswoman Frankel on the Protecting Americans Abroad Act, which allows state to hire the best of the best when it comes to security, not the cheapest. We're proud of that. We have a bipartisan committee here, and this is not political what we're doing here. We know that it's important to learn from mistakes, but we also need accountability, which is why we're here today. We need to show the American people who we are beholden to, tax-paying Americans, that we are responsible. But it also sends a message that being inept will not be tolerated, and this will never, ever happen again. People are dead. There are 4 men who are dead. The young girls will never walk down their aisle with their father at their wedding. Young boys will never be able to toss a football with their dad. And the people who are responsible for this have been relieved of their senior positions. You had said it earlier, reassignment equals accountability. It does not equal accountability. Reassignment does not equal accountability. They're reassigned. They're being put into another position where they've never missed a paycheck, where they're going to have their cushy government job, and they're still going to get a pension. In the real world, this would never happen. This would never, ever happen. They would be fired. They would be terminated because they failed. And 4 people, including an ambassador, are dead. This is unacceptable. I hope that in a bipartisan fashion we can, in some way, shape, or form, actually have someone be held accountable. And that not only within our own government, but let's pray that we find the people that are responsible for this attack, because everyone has blood on their hands. It is unacceptable. Reassignment does not equal accountability. Mr. Chair, I yield the rest of my time. My question was answered.
We go now to Mr. Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Kennedy, thank you for being here. I agree with the congressmen on my left, or to the left over here, Ingalls, Meeks, and Connolly, that we should focus on making our embassy and personnel safer around the world. However, in order to do that, we must look at our failures of the past so we do not make those same mistakes again. And I want to kind of reference a report here. Deputy Chief of Missions for Embassy Tripoli, Gregory Hicks, stated that Secretary Clinton wanted Benghazi converted to a permanent constituent post. Ambassador Pickering, when he was asked by the ARB and when this was discussed, he kind of looked surprised, looked both ways. Does the 7th floor know about this? And it brought up questioning that they should look at this through the ARB, which stands for Accountability Review Board. In addition, looking back at the past, the 1999 ARB report states that the issued response to the bombings of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya and Tanzania. This report urged that the Secretary of State should take a personal and active role in carrying out the responsibility of ensuring the security of U.S. diplomatic personnel abroad. And the board should have questioned the extent to which the Secretary fulfilled or did not fulfill this mandate. And again, with Ambassador Stevens making multiple requests for security and being denied in lieu of this report that looks in the past so that we don't make those same reports again, would you agree that we should have probably questioned higher up in the chain of command? And I'm going to do you a favor. My questions are going to be pretty much yes or no.
Your first question about permanent posts in Benghazi, the Secretary of State never said to me, establish a permanent post in Benghazi, and I would have been the person who would have launched
Mr. Chairman, I've got this report here. I'll submit it for questioning. Let me ask you this. Okay, go ahead, the second one.
Your second one, the Secretary of State does take her responsibilities very, very seriously. As I mentioned earlier, when I went to the Secretary of State and said the situation in Damascus, Syria, had reached the point where we could no longer mitigate the risk, the Secretary instantaneously replied, take the people out. We had no actionable intelligence, as the Director of National Intelligence had said, about this threat in Benghazi, and therefore I never went to the Secretary of State and told her it was time to leave Benghazi.
All right, let me ask you this. I'm going to cut you off. Do you think that the ARB should have questioned higher up is the question, yes or no?
That's the judgment for the ARB.
All right. Who do you report to directly?
I report to the Secretary of State.
All right. So is it fair to say that you are accountable to the Secretary? You said yes. As the Undersecretary for Management, you're responsible for the people, resources, budget, facilities, technology, financial, operations, consular affairs, logistics, contracting, and security for the Department of State operations, and is the Secretary's principal advisor on management issues. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. The people under you report directly to you, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. You oversee their day-to-day operations.
Yes, sir.
They are accountable to you, and you said that's correct. If they fill in their job description and it affects your department, say mission objective, would that ultimately be your responsibility? Yes or no?
Absolutely.
All right. Would it be a sign of lack of management?
Not necessarily.
Would it be a lack of failure of your job and responsibility?
Not necessarily.
Since you stated that you report directly to the Secretary, and if you fail at your job due to your subordinates, you're saying it's not necessarily your superior's fault either.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Correct.
For the record, Ms. Clinton was the Secretary of State at the time. We all know that. The reports I have, and when I was president with this committee, and we interviewed Ms. Clinton, she stated that she requested personally for Ambassador Stevens to come to this post to take this assignment. Are you aware of that?
Yes, sir. I'm the one who set up the appointment between Chris and the Secretary.
The reports I have said that the embassy in Benghazi was understaffed and underprotected by the standards at the time. Is that correct?
That is the ARB's conclusion.
All right. I also, the reports I read said that Ambassador Stevens said there were increased tensions between the personnel and local Benghazi population. That's correct, isn't it?
That was what Chris reported. But there were no threats against the U.S. temporary mission facility or against our personnel.
Reports also stated that Ambassador Stevens had requested increased security on more than one occasion, correct?
That is correct.
Reports said that the request for increased security was turned down each time, and we know that's correct. Who turned those down? Do you know?
I have reviewed the situation, and every request, as I've testified before, every request that was made for improvements were okayed and funded, with the exception of the 4 guard towers, which I mentioned earlier.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yoho. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Meadows is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Kennedy, this gets down to 2 things. One is accountability, and the second is trust. And we must have the accountability before we can restore the trust of the American people in terms of what happened in Benghazi or what may happen in the future. So I'd like to refocus our attention on these 4 people that you say they've lost their titles. But let me be clear. They have not lost any money or any benefits, yes or no?
No.
Okay. So they've gotten paid. They've got an 8-month paid leave while the State Department has done their investigation, yes or no?
Correct.
All right, so they've been off for 8 months. I also serve on the Government Reform Committee, and I know that we've made a number of requests that have gone unanswered, really. Were there any adverse, other than title changes and post changes, were there any adverse personnel actions that were taken against these 4 people that, according to the ARB, were systemically involved in mismanagement?
That's not the ARB actually, sir, talked about 2 people.
Okay, but those 2 people
others
being part of the 4, but the 2 people, did any adverse actions happen to those 2 people other than title changes?
Sir,
yes or no?
A title change
I understand in your opinion a title change is a big deal, but we're talking about people, 4 dead Americans, so let's look at it. Anything other than that?
being removed as a Deputy Assistant Secretary is a major act.
All right. Well, so let me go on. You mentioned the consideration of other posts, and you mentioned two people. It's troubling for me to start to hear reports of where these two people are being considered for very high-profile, secure posts overseas, and knowing that the State Department takes about 12 months to go through that, it means that that review process had to have started while they were on administrative leave. Are you aware of that?
You're correct, sir, that the process we assign in the
So
summer.
are you aware that they're
summer,
being considered for high-profile, secure positions overseas? Yes or no? Are you aware?
I am unaware. They have not been assigned anywhere.
I understand they haven't been assigned. You're avoiding my question.
No.
Are you aware that they're being considered for high-profile, secure positions overseas?
I guess the answer is no. I mean, obviously...
It's either a yes or a no. Are you aware?
Obviously, sir, while this is pending, one has to look at the two...
But you're in charge.
Well, yes, sir, but there are two options here. The Secretary of State, as he expressed in his letter...
I don't want a narrative. No. Are you aware, yes or no?
Obviously, we had to have options. The Secretary of State's letter said he was either going to fire them or make another decision. Depending on what decision
But this is a high-profile post.
I'm afraid I don't know this level of detail.
Well, are you willing, as the person in charge, you just said you were in charge,
yes,
are you willing to report back to this committee within 30 days to make us aware, and I'm assuming from your response that you wouldn't be supportive of any high-profile posting for these two individuals. Is that correct? You would not be supportive of that?
I would not be supportive of any position in which these individuals had the same levels of responsibility.
No, that's not what I'm asking. But a high-profile post overseas, that's what I'm asking. No, so you are supportive of it?
No, sir. I am neither one nor the other. I'm just saying, sir, that profile and responsibility are two different things.
Well, but that's a judgment call on your part. Well, let me go on a little bit further then.
Please.
This report talks about bonuses, between $10,000 to $15,000 bonuses that are given to State Departments. Up until 2011, those were disclosed publicly.
Right.
It now appears that either you or Secretary Clinton have made a decision not to disclose those. Is that correct?
I am unaware of that.
So you're unaware of that.
I will
so you would be glad to support it, because it's been suggested that some of these people in the ARB got bonuses, and that now we're not disclosing it because it would look bad. You're not aware of that?
I'm also not aware that anybody subject to the ARB got a bonus. I will confirm that, but I am not aware that they got.
So who made the decision, you or Secretary Clinton, to not be transparent with regard to bonus?
I am not aware. I don't think it was either of us, but I have to go back and find out. I may have done something, but that is a level of detail.
If you'll report back, I yield back.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Meadows. Mr. Stockman of Texas.
Thank you. I have to say, after that brief exchange with my colleague, Mr. Meadows, my earlier colleague asked if you knew some words. And what I'm puzzled at is you earlier mentioned that you hadn't made a determination of what caused the attack, but on all the talk shows we heard was a video, including the President. But he was asking if you knew some words, and I'm going to ask you if you know some words, yes or no. Do you know the word stonewalling? Do you know the word cover-up?
Yes, sir.
Do you know the word scandal?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I'm going to yield the balance of my time to my good friend from California, Dana, because I feel that's what happened here today, and I think Mr. Meadows' line of questioning fits those three questions or definitions.
Thank you very much for yielding to me. Let me just note there are two distinct views of this whole episode in American history. We have you telling us that you believe that since that murder of our ambassador and 3 other Americans, that terrorist attack, that there's been a full court press on the part of the administration to bring those to justice and to get the word out about the American people. The opposite view is just expressed by my friend Mr. Stockman, where it seems to be is a year of obfuscation, stonewalling, denial, and cover-up. I think that it is vital for the American people to understand the truth of which of these views reflects reality. Let me ask you just a couple of questions. How many government employees, including the agency and State Department, et cetera, how many federal government employees were in Benghazi the night of the attack?
Madam Chair, I respectfully cannot answer questions that involve classified information in this session.
Well, would you be, if I could interrupt the gentleman, we could do that in a classified setting as early as tomorrow, the next day?
I am prepared to appear before this committee at any time.
All right, okay. So let me ask you something. To your knowledge, has any of these, because we have been told there are a number of figures out there in terms of maybe up to 40 people, 45 people present, some of whom, or many of whom, had skills enough to be engaged in defending our ambassador and preventing that attack, or at least thwarting it. Have any of those people, those who were there, of course you can't tell us how many, have any of them been asked not to cooperate with congressional or media inquiries or to take lie detector tests?
I am unaware of any State Department personnel being instructed like that, and the State Department does not utilize lie detector tests except in exceptional.
Yeah, I'm very happy. You know, look, weasel words. I'm unaware of State Department. Did I ask State Department? I don't think I asked about the State Department. I asked if any of you have any knowledge of any of those people who were on the scene. Now, you can't tell us how many there were, but you know they were there. Have any of them been told not to cooperate with a congressional investigation? Don't hedge it with, I don't know, the State Department people. That wasn't the question.
But I am the Undersecretary of State for Management, sir, and can only answer questions about the State Department.
All right. Okay. Well, that's a good dodge as well. Let me ask you this. There's an ambassador who's been murdered. We have 3 other people who have been murdered. It's a terrorist attack. Why is it the CIA and why aren't they the ones doing this investigation? Why is it the FBI? I thought the FBI was supposed to be doing internal domestic investigations.
By statute, sir, the FBI is charged with the responsibility for the killing of any American citizen overseas. That is an FBI responsibility by statute.
Okay.
The FBI obviously works with the CIA and works with the military, but that is a congressional statute that gives the FBI that responsibility.
That gives them the sole responsibility?
The FBI is a law enforcement agency, sir.
And this is not, and let me make it very clear, we're not talking about a crime in the United States. We're not talking about law enforcement, and this is one of the distinct differences between the administration and other people who disagree with its approach. What we're talking about here is a terrorist attack, which is not a criminal matter, which is a matter of national security, which the CIA and all the rest of our intelligence agencies should have been involved in. Instead, we give it to people who are treating it as a crime, who don't want to go into Benghazi because they haven't been given permission. This is absolutely absurd, and I think it's not. I don't think that is lost on the American people.
If I might, sir, the FBI is a member of the intelligence community. The FBI is both a national security, a law enforcement, and an intelligence agency.
And you described this as breaking of a law. They're also basic law enforcers. Terrorism and terrorism threat to the United States is a security issue, and if the CIA and these other people are giving it over to our law enforcement, FBI, it's a mistaken decision from the top. Thank you.
Yes, we want to thank Ambassador Kennedy for his time here today. And
yes, we do.
As we've heard, the committee is deeply concerned with the lack of accountability at the State Department. Several members have outstanding questions. We've been trying for some time to get those documents directly. So we know that the Department will be answering those outstanding questions in a timely fashion, but again, we reiterate We need those answers. We need those documents here at the committee, and we thank you again, Ambassador Kennedy, for your testimony today. We thank the members as well. We stand adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
And while we continue to wait for a senator to come to the floor, we take you to the White House news briefing.
And in the 14th century, it's been known that it's better to be feared than loved when it comes to these things. Why
Probably prior to that.
Yeah, okay. But why hasn't he done some more in arm twisting, for example? I don't want to go to kneecaps, but arm twisting.
He has twisted arms. He has used the powers that are available to him to try to convince, persuade, cajole Republicans into doing the sensible thing, which is not threatening to shut the government down, not threatening to default, but working with him on a compromise. And what they said they wanted when it came to some of their demands on entitlement reforms, he gave. And then they walked away and didn't come back. So at some point, you have to have a negotiating partner who's willing to, if you're willing to compromise, they have to be willing to compromise too. And instead, what we have in the House now is a situation where the House leadership indicates a reasonable approach to making sure the government shuts down, and the rank-and-file members say no, so the House leadership says never mind.
So
we cannot, as much as we would like to be in charge of the House Republicans, we're not. And that's not how the system works.
He's not to blame at all. Is that
I'm just saying that it's his responsibility to offer compromises, and he has. It is also absolutely the right position to take that he and no president should negotiate over Congress's responsibility to pay its bills.
Can you afford to remain above the fray like that?
Again, you're assuming that he's above the fray. He's not. He's in the fray. And he was in the fray today, and he'll be in the fray until Congress does the right thing.
With talk.
As opposed to what, Bill?
That's what I mean.
I don't think we'll take up arms, okay? I think we're just going to have to, this is going to have to be worked out, and Congress is going to have to act. Yeah.
Jay, when you told John the debt ceiling is never attached to anything, don't you from
I said the opposite.
You said it's not attached to other issues, that the Congress does it as it stands alone.
I said that in the past, in order to mitigate the unpleasantness of voting for raising the debt ceiling, it has been attached to other bills that aren't germane that we're going to pass so that the debt ceiling has been raised.
Sure.
And that has been used as an example by the Speaker of times when the debt ceiling itself, raising the debt ceiling itself, has been negotiated over, which until 2011 had not been the case.
Right. But based on 2011 at that podium, you often take credit for $2 trillion in spending cuts the President got that were attached to the last debt ceiling fight. So when you get something you want it's a good thing. And if it's something about health care or whatever, it's a bad thing. That's the, you tout that you got $2 trillion
The
in
President
spending cuts,
put
right?
forward a proposal to reduce the deficit beyond what was included in that deal.
You think that was a good thing? You got
No,
$2
we
trillion.
don't think the sequester was a good thing.
I'm not talking about sequester. I'm talking
Sequester
about
was part of that deal.
part of that deal. But you touted again and again.
$1.2 trillion in $1.2 trillion.
Small part of that.
Actually
It's
not, but you got to go back and check your facts. There was the initial reduction in non-defense discretionary spending that was part of that deal was roughly $1.2 trillion. Josh, am I right along those lines? $1 trillion. And that represented a compromise between the President and the Republicans. Then the Supercommittee was tasked with coming up with additional deficit reduction, and if it did not, and if Congress failed to act in the ensuing year to come up with that more responsibly achieved deficit reduction, in a balanced way, as the President saw it, then the sequester would kick in. We've never said that the sequester itself was good policy or that we take credit for it. Far from it. The President has long said the right and responsible thing to do would be to reduce our deficit in a balanced way so that the burden of deficit reduction does not fall solely on the shoulders of the middle class.
You say it's such a bad thing for Republicans to want to delay the health care implementation. The President has delayed pieces of the law, and you've said that was a smart way to do it. We need to more slowly implement it, help businesses deal with it. So if the Republicans come up with it, why is it such a bad idea if they say, let's slow walk some pieces of this? When you do it, it's perfectly fine.
Ed,
well, you did, right? On the businesses, you said they can delay.
On the employer responsibility provision, which represents a very small portion of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, it was the right and responsible thing to do, reacting in part to the requests of businesses to delay implementation of that for a year. As every Republican who is pushing the idea of delaying implementation of the individual responsibility provision, they know that that is the heart of the Affordable Care Act. It is what is essential to ensuring that everyone in your extended family who has a pre-existing condition can still get health insurance and isn't blackballed by the insurance companies to making that work, making sure that the individual responsibility provision is there. Furthermore, delaying it would do what? Add to the deficit. So in the name of deficit reduction, Republicans are saying we should add to the deficit even as we're taking away health care from millions of Americans. Seems like a bad idea.
You a couple times mentioned that John Boehner in March said that shutting down the government was a bad idea, and now apparently...
Over Obamacare, specifically.
Over that specifically. Now he's changed his mind. The President changed his mind on Syria. It wasn't a bad thing. He thought it was smart. Go to Congress.
Where?
I'm just asking. These are the facts you've been presenting every day at this podium for the last couple of weeks.
But Ed,
he was not going to go to Congress to vote on Syria. Then he changed his mind. Everyone here says it's a great idea. He slowed everything down. John Boehner changed his mind. What's wrong with that?
Because shutting down the government over Obamacare is a bad idea. Going to Congress to seek an authorization for the use of military force was a good idea, according to hundreds of members of Congress.
We haven't been able to get it.
There hasn't been a vote. Ed, I'm not sure the arguments you're making. I see oranges and I see apples, but I don't see...
Let me ask you then, let me ask you about a specific thing on Syria. Last night there was a forum where two of the President's former defense secretaries, Mr. Panetta and Mr. Gates, were there. They both said going to Congress to authorize force was a bad idea, number one. Number two, Mr. Gates said, even though I know previously he's put out a statement saying he supports a mission in Syria, he said that airstrikes would be, quote, throwing gasoline on a very complex fire. And he went on to say, quote, my bottom line is if you blow up a bunch of stuff over a couple of days to validate a point or principle is not a strategy. How do you respond to that, former defense secretary?
Well, I would say two things. One, the President does believe that it was the right thing to do, given that there was not an imminent threat to the United States, given that military action, the success of military action was not dependent on acting immediately, and therefore there was time to allow debate in Congress, that Congress should be consulted, and Congress should be given the right to vote on authorization. The President's been very clear about that. Others can disagree, and that's fine, but the President believes it was the right thing to do. Secondly, it was precisely because of the credible threat of U.S. military action that we saw Syria do an about-face. A nation that had, or a government that had, refused to acknowledge that it even possessed chemical weapons, and for 20 years had refused to be a signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention, one of the very few nations on earth to refuse to sign that, utterly changed its position on both issues within days because of the credible threat of U.S. military action. The same is true for Russia, which had prior to their adoption of this proposal to have Syria give up its chemical weapons, turn them over to international supervision, and be signatories to the CWC, had acted aggressively to block all efforts to hold Assad accountable. Now, there is a diplomatic avenue available to achieving the President's goals that allow, without the use of military force, and the President believes it's the right thing to do to pursue it. That avenue opened up because of the threat of force. And for that reason, as well as others, it's important to make clear that the threat of force remains on the table. None of these issues are easy. None of the decisions that a leader makes in these circumstances are obvious or clear. But I think it is hard to argue that we are not globally in a better place when it comes to Syria's chemical weapons today than we were 3 weeks ago, when Syria had used chemical weapons against its own people, when Syria denied that it even possessed chemical weapons, when Syria refused to be a signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and certainly had not even entertained publicly the idea of giving up its chemical weapons. So we have a long way to travel on this road, and a lot of work to do, and a lot of verification to achieve. But the positions the President took helped bring us to this point, which is a better point than where we were in the past.
Jay, NBC's Ann Curry sat down for an exclusive interview with Iran's President Rouhani today in Tehran. I know we addressed this briefly yesterday, but I just want to follow up and make sure I get it on the record again today. Does the President have any plans to meet with the Iranian President during the United Nations meetings in New York?
There are currently no plans for the President to meet with President Rouhani at the United Nations General Assembly. I think it's fair to say that the President believes there is an opportunity for diplomacy when it comes to the issues that have presented challenges to the United States and our allies with regards to Iran. And we hope that the Iranian government takes advantage of this opportunity. We have heard a lot in the world from President Rouhani's administration about its desire to improve the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran's relations with the international community. And President Obama believes we should test that assertion. And we are, and we will do that. As you know, the President mentioned in an interview with George Stephanopoulos that he and President Rouhani have exchanged letters. And in his letter, the President indicated that the U.S. is ready to resolve the nuclear issue in a way that allows Iran to demonstrate that its nuclear program is for exclusively peaceful purposes. The letter also conveyed the need to act with a sense of urgency to address this issue because, as we have long said, the window of opportunity for resolving this diplomatically is open, but it will not remain open indefinitely.
Yeah, in that event that was held last night, the former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta also said that the President should have directed limited action in Syria. He went on to say that Iran is paying very close attention to what we're doing. There's no question in my mind they're looking at the situation, and what they are seeing is an element of weakness. Is Leon Panetta wrong in that assessment?
Well, I would say a couple of things. No, I have enormous respect. The President has enormous respect and appreciation for both of his former Secretaries of Defense. But as your two questions noted, they actually disagree on this issue, which only reinforces the fact that these are not easy decisions to make or easy positions to take. The President believes that the credible threat of military force was important and remains important, and that it has brought about this potential for a diplomatic resolution. He believes it was the right thing to do, to go to Congress for authorization prior to the diplomatic breakthrough. And he understands that others can differ with that view, that others might say he or any president should have deployed military force without going to Congress. The President believed, consistent with the principles he's espoused since he was a candidate for president, that given the fact that there was not an imminent threat to the United States, and given that the military response that he was calling for could be executed successfully, even if there was a delay allowing for a congressional debate, that it was the right thing to do to go to Congress. He understood and made clear when he made his announcement in the Rose Garden that this would be a tough debate. And that does not take away from the fact that it was a good debate and the right debate to have.
Briefly on the topic of the shooting that took place only a few miles from here at the Navy Yard, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, today said that those who have served in the military shouldn't be stigmatized by having to answer questions about their mental health status on security clearance forms. Acknowledging there's a review in place right now, what's the President's position on whether there should be greater mental health checks done, more information provided by people that want to become contractors in that form?
Well, there is a review taking place, one that has been ongoing with regard to some contractors that is being undertaken by the ODNI, and then another that is being undertaken by the Office of Management and Budget here at the President's direction. And I wouldn't want to dictate what the outcomes of that review should be. There's obviously an issue, broadly speaking, separate from matters of clearances, but broadly speaking, when it comes to gun violence, there's an issue that is important to examine when it comes to mental health. And that was something the President talked about when he put forward his comprehensive plan to reduce gun violence, and it is something that he believes is important to talk about today. How that plays into security clearances and work clearances for contractors, I think we should wait and see once these reviews are done.
Given what you've described as the obstructionist bent that we've seen from some congressional Republicans, would you say that does the President believe that the best way to achieve his second-term goals might be through the midterm elections and getting a Democratic Congress in the
President is not waiting to achieve any of these goals, to push for the achievement of any of these goals that help create a better bargain for the middle class, that help make the middle class stronger through broad economic growth and job creation, through education investment and investment in research and development and new energy and infrastructure. So, you know, he's put forward these proposals, he's put forward his compromise proposals on the budget, and he's continued to press leaders in Congress to take him up in discussion and debate about moving forward on these issues. That includes his tax reform proposal, coupling corporate tax reform with investments in infrastructure and job creation. So he's throwing out ideas to try to see if he can move the ball forward when it comes to growing our economy, and he's going to continue doing that. You know, a term in office for the President may to some seem like a long time, 4 years, but there is much work to be done, and he's not going to wait for elections or you know, changes in the seasons to try to move forward. That's, you know, he's been pushing this ball uphill sometimes, frequently, from the day he took office. And as we've noted on this 5-year anniversary of the financial collapse, you know, there has been a great deal achieved. You know, that remembering where we were 5 years ago is to almost, you know, reinsert yourself into a nightmare. When you think back about the fears that everyone was dealing with in September of 2008, and for the next 18 months, really, at least. And it's important as we do that to remember that many millions of Americans are still struggling, and we need to make the right decisions to make sure that the economy grows and more good-paying middle-class jobs are created. 7.5 million is a lot, but it is not nearly enough. We need to press on. Anybody? All right.
Earlier this year, the President had a real...
When do you go to London?
January. Got me for a few more months yet.
All right. Well, make sure I get an invitation to the going-away party.
Absolutely. The President had a real charm offensive with Republicans. He took them to dinner, he paid out of pocket, he went to a nice restaurant. Is the difference between that approach a few months ago and this sort of going to business leaders and speaking publicly instead of courting Republicans in person, does that reflect a sense in the White House that the charm offensive failed, that the wooing them didn't work?
We have tried, and we will try, all manner of ways to get to yes with Republican leaders when it comes to doing the responsible thing.
on budget policy and on raising the debt ceiling, and on a bunch of other issues like immigration reform. I mean, I think that while it was notable that the President footed the bill for a very expensive dinner at a very nice restaurant in a lovely hotel up the street here, there were many other meetings with the President and with the Chief of Staff and with the Vice President and others, with lawmakers well into the year, and you know, all around this effort of trying to find common ground. And I think that what we discovered is that there is a sincere desire by Republican lawmakers, some of them anyway, and not an insignificant number of them, to try to work out a way to make budget policy and economic policy that reduces the deficit responsibly but invests responsibly as well, and in a way that is fair to the middle class. And you know, the President remains hopeful that, you know, those members who sincerely want to achieve that will be able to, working with him and working with Democrats. In the meantime, you know, we're going to keep pressing, at the very least, when it comes to these deadlines, that Washington not inflict harm on the economy. You know, we may not be able to achieve the big deal when it comes to a long-term budget with Congress between now and October 1st, but we certainly shouldn't therefore allow, and the Republicans in the House should not insist upon, shutting down the government over that, or over the fact that Obamacare is the law of the land and it's being implemented and it's been upheld by the Supreme Court and it's providing benefits to millions of people. You know, I understand that we understand that you know, those Republicans who feel adamantly about this oppose the law, and they've campaigned on it and they've talked about it and they've voted on it, but they should not then pair it with shutting down the government or defaulting on our obligations. Phil.
Okay, two questions. First on Kathy Rumler. Does the President have any opinion on her leaving? Is there any kind of timetable to replace her in the counsel's office? And
well, I can confirm that she will be leaving at the end of the year, so she's here for a good bit longer. And you know, that the President had asked her to stay on as long as she has and will, and that she is an enormous asset and a very important advisor to the President, and one of the smartest people I've ever met, and one of the best people I've ever worked with. So we will all be sad to see her go when she goes. Beyond that, I have no you know, information to provide, as ever, on personnel decisions by the President.
Has he identified a successor, or is this going to
Again, I have no information to divulge on that matter or any other personnel matter.
And on immigration,
as long as you're asking.
Well, I wanted to ask. On immigration, yesterday the President said in the Telemundo interview that he was not going to use executive authority to delay deportations of illegal immigrants. Some immigration advocates wish he would do more while Congress is still sort of kind of stalled out on his bill.
Well, what the President has made clear is that, you know, comprehensive immigration reform is the way to resolve our immigration challenges. And when it comes to this matter of deportations and the idea that there's a plan B available to him, he said yesterday in the interview that you cited that it's not an option. He said, quote, that to do so would be ignoring the law in a way that I think would be very difficult to defend legally. That's not an option. You know, if John Boehner, going back to the Speaker of the House, would put the Senate Comprehensive Immigration Bill on the floor of the House today, it would pass and the President would sign it. We're confident of that. There is a majority, not only in the nation, but even in Congress, to achieve this important piece of legislation that would grow our economy and reduce our deficit, that would provide a system to allow for the best and the brightest from other countries who study here to stay here and start businesses here, and would ensure that everybody is playing by the same set of rules, whether it's employers or people working in the United States, that they're paying their taxes and contributing to the common good. So The President believes that the House ought to do that. He is entirely confident that comprehensive immigration reform will pass, will become law, and that he will be the one who signs it into law, and the House ought to do it right away and maybe address some of the political challenges that they've been encountering lately by doing so. Yes.
Jumping back to Aaron Alexis, does the White House have any sense for how sequestration and budget cuts have affected the background clearance check process, and has that had any impact on this case?
I would point you to the investigation and the FBI who are making assessments about this particular case, and I'm not aware of any impacts one way or the other of sequestration on background check systems or security systems. These are all under review as a general matter by the DNI and by the OMB, and I imagine that piece of it will be taken into account.
Thanks, Chair.
See you.
Thanks. Mr. Netanyahu said yesterday that the way to end the Iranian nuclear crisis was for Iran to stop enriching uranium, to ship out uranium that it's enriched out of the country, to close Qum, and to stop plutonium activity. The President yesterday said in his interview that the way for it to end would be for Iran not to weaponize its nuclear program. Does that not show that despite the good feeling of the President's trip to Israel earlier this year, that the two sides are still, deeply divided on the fundamental weight?
No, I don't think. I mean, both are ways for Iran to resolve its obligations to the international community when it comes to nuclear weapons. Any resolution would have to come through a verifiable compliance and a verifiable commitment by Iran to give up its nuclear weapons ambitions. That has long been our position. So again, we're ready to talk in the P5+1 as well as bilaterally with Iran if Iran is willing to engage substantively on this matter. Libby. Yeah.
What's the President's thoughts on, for the first time, an Indian American winning the Miss America pageant?
I haven't spoken about it with him, so I don't have his thoughts, but I think it's great, personally. But
Is he aware about the racial slurs he is facing after he won the beauty?
I'm sorry?
Is he aware about the racial hatred he's facing?
Again, I haven't discussed that with him, so I don't have a presidential response. Thank you all very much.
The underlying legislation on the Senate floor, an energy efficiency bill. They're in a quorum call now over in the House. The House is going through a series of votes, including the vote on a rule for a bill dealing with strategic minerals. Votes in the House this afternoon. Final votes on that bill later this afternoon. Off the floor, the House discussions continue on continuing spending, continuing federal spending, the implementation of the health care law, and also the impending debt ceiling. Republican leaders this morning announced they will bring to the House floor this week a continuing resolution that will fund the federal government through December 15th at sequester levels and extend the nation's authority to borrow and deny funding for the implementation of the health care law. Speaker Boehner and other Republican leaders, spoke with reporters for about 10 minutes.
Where's Eric?
There it goes. Oh, it's a long walk.
Oh, there you are. You know, the president thinks that American families and small businesses are doing just fine in this economy. Speech after speech is about justifying his failed policies. And one of his biggest failures is adding $6 trillion to the national debt. You know, for decades, Congresses and presidents have used the debt limit for legislation to cut spending, and even President Obama worked with us 2 years ago in the debt limit negotiations to put controls on spending. This year is not going to be any different. We're going to continue to do everything we can to repeal the president's failed health care law. This week, the House will pass a CR that locks the sequester savings in and defunds Obamacare. The president has signed 7 bills over the last 2.5 years to make changes to Obamacare, and I sincerely hope our friends in the Senate have plans to make this an 8th time. The law is a train wreck. The president has protected American big business. It's time to protect American families from this unworkable law.
Good morning. First, I want to express my deepest condolences to the families who have lost a loved one on Monday in the horrific attack on the Navy Yard just blocks away from Capitol Hill. It is in these tragic moments that we also witness the steel resolve of all those who serve our nation there, as well as the first responders who came to help. Now, we just come out of our conference and had a very good discussion on our work on a budget measure that will continue our record of reduced government spending and deals head-on with Obamacare. Not since the Korean War has the federal government reduced spending 2 years in a row. We aim to make that happen. And we aim to put a stop to Obamacare before it costs one more job or raises a family's out-of-pocket expenses one more dollar. And that fight will continue as we negotiate the debt limit with the President and the Senate. In the coming weeks, we will unveil a plan to extend our nation's ability to borrow while delaying Obamacare and protecting working middle-class families from its horrific effects. Those discussions will also focus on a path forward on tax reform and the Keystone Pipeline, and a variety of other measures designed to lower energy prices, simplify our tax system, and get our economy going for the middle-class working people of this country. Together, we House Republicans will not ignore the problem of our debt or the problems facing the working middle class of this country. And so we hope and we ask that this President finally engage with Congress and work with us on behalf of the American families.
We all join with the comments that the leader made on the loss that we saw this Monday. I will tell you, we just walked out of conference, and I noticed all of you stay outside to see what's the feel, what's the motion, what does it look like. I have not watched our conference be so united as we walk into this battle. I think you're going to see a very big excitement coming through this week and next week as well as we move legislation. The excitement is the united conference going after the battle we've always been willing to wage, but now we're going to look forward to the Senate joining with us. The President laid out many times of different portions of his health care bill that's not prepared for the rest of the nation. We think his time is delayed. And we think using the President, and it's not just us who talk about it, the union leaders as well. He wants to pick just big business to save. We think the individual matters more. And that's what you'll see come forward out of the House.
I'd like to join in offering condolences to the families that lost their loved ones on Monday. Our hearts and our prayers continue to be with them. And it was a terrible day here in our nation's capital. Also on Monday, we heard from the President regarding the economy, and he said that, quote, we need to work together to create jobs, grow our economy, and expand opportunity. And what I'd like to remind the President is that that has been our goal since day one. And it's unfortunate that it is many of the President's policies that are making it harder on Americans all across this country. And we see Americans that continue to have a tough time finding a job in this economy. They're seeing their premiums go up for their health insurance. It's harder at the gas pump. This is the longest, 1,000 days plus, that gas has been over $3 a gallon. First time ever. At the grocery store, it's harder to pay the bills. And the Republicans are focused on policies that will make it easier, that will create a climate, a stronger economy for America, so that people will have an easier time finding a job, paying the bills, and for those that are graduating from college, finding a job. That's our commitment. These are not just numbers, these are real people's lives, and the policies that we debate day in and day out make a difference in people's lives. And we are committed to working with the President, working with the Senate, where we can, to move policies forward that are going to make a positive difference and get people back to work.
The President did say earlier this week that the economy is not where he would like it to be, something that my constituents are very well aware of every time they go to the doctor, go to the grocery store, fill up their automobile with gasoline. It is not where it needs to be. And after 5 years as President, we are hoping that he will turn to Congress and work with us to improve this economy. The unemployment rate was slightly down this month, but it's because people have all but given up looking for work. I think the more important statistic is that the workforce participation rate is the lowest it's been in 35 years, the lowest since 1978. And while we stand ready to work with the President on a number of issues that have been articulated already on the health care law to Keystone, tax reform is something that those of us on Ways and Means have been working on for several years now. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Every minute we refuse to pursue tax reform, we are incentivizing businesses to take their jobs offshore. That's the wrong answer. We have been working very hard to make life easier for our small businesses by lowering the rates, eliminating the loopholes that only the very wealthy take advantage of. We want to put more money in hardworking American taxpayers' pockets, and so we stand ready to work with the President and hope he will engage at some point in reforming our tax code so we can get this economy moving and the American people back to work.
Thank you, and appreciate some of the comments made by the President and Vice President this week regarding the economy and the necessity to do infrastructure jobs. In fact, Mr. Biden was at a port talking about the infrastructure of our country. But yet there's been one infrastructure project that has, because of political reasons, been ignored. No action taken by this administration. I'm talking about the Keystone XL pipeline. Tomorrow marks an interesting anniversary. It's the 5th year anniversary of the Keystone permit filing. Now, what's particularly interesting about this administration ignoring this infrastructure and jobs and economic driver bill and project is that shortly into his first year, the President did sign and the State Department did recommend a cross-border permit of a pipeline carrying oil sands into the United States. So the President didn't have a problem with the Alberta Clipper pipeline delivering oil into the United States and crossing the border until it became an environmental issue on the Keystone Pipeline. And only then, and because of politics, has the President refused to act on the permit. So I'm proud that our leadership is now discussing and contemplating putting Keystone Pipeline in whatever opportunities we may have with debt ceiling and continuing resolutions. I appreciate our leadership continued focus on this type of a job bill.
Question.
Speaker, no secret that you did not want to attach Obamacare to, defunding Obamacare to this spending bill. I know it's not been easy to be the Speaker over this caucus, but at this point, have you just kind of lost control over the caucus?
Listen, we've got a lot of divergent opinions in the caucus, and the key to any leadership job is to listen. You know, I was here during the Gingrich era. He had a little plaque that was in his office, and it was a management model. Listen, learn, help, and lead. We listened to our colleagues over the course of the last week. We have a plan that they're happy with. We're going forward.
Mr. Speaker, doesn't this, to some degree, by moving this to the Senate, I know there's some of the plan last week, but isn't that a fait accompli? I mean, there's not going to be 60 votes. Harry Reid is probably going to strip certain things out of there, including health care.
Listen, the fight over here has been won. The House has voted 40 times to defund, change Obamacare, to repeal it. It's time for the Senate to have this fight.
But don't you know what's going to happen?
I'm not going to predict what the Senate's going to do or not do.
Mr. Speaker, will you let the House work its will and vote up or down on whatever the Senate's going to think?
I'm not going to speculate on what the Senate's going to do or not do, or what we're going to do or not do, because it's very premature.
Our last question. Mr. Speaker, do you believe that the implications and the ramifications of a possible government shutdown are the same for the Republican Party this time as they were in 1999?
Listen, there should be no conversation about shutting the government down. That's not the goal here. Our goal here is to cut spending and to protect the American people from Obamacare. It's as simple as that. There's no interest on our part in shutting the government down. Thanks.
House Republican leaders earlier today announcing that they will bring to the floor later this week a continuing resolution funding the federal government through December the 15th at sequester levels. It would also extend the nation's ability to borrow and deny funding for the implementation of the 2010 health care law. That news conference from this morning. On that also, the Rules Committee of the House will be meeting this afternoon for possible consideration of a rule for that continuing resolution bill, and look for possible coverage later on the C-SPAN networks. Here in the Senate, they've been in and out of quorum calls throughout the afternoon. The underlying bill is an energy efficiency bill, legislation aimed at helping manufacturers develop energy-efficient technologies for their businesses. The quorum call continues, and we're going to take you to comments from Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Martin Dempsey. They today ordered a worldwide review of security at defense installations around the world. We'll show you what we can of their comments as this quorum call continues.
Good morning. Let me begin with a few words about Monday's tragedy. As the investigation proceeds into the shooting at the Washington Navy Yard, I've been consulting closely with DOD's leadership, including Secretary Mavis and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Greener, as well as with our federal and law enforcement officials. I also conferred yesterday with the FBI Director, Director Comey, the Attorney General Holder, and President Obama. First, our thoughts and our prayers are with the victims, their families, and all who have been affected by what happened at the Navy shipyard on Monday. We will grieve, we will remember, and we will comfort each other. The Department of Defense is a strong and resilient community, and we will do everything we can to help our colleagues at the Navy Yard get through this terrible, terrible time. In the coming days, more information will come to light about what happened, about what went wrong, and importantly, what must be fixed. Yesterday, I directed 2 department-wide reviews. These reviews will be led by Deputy Secretary Ash Carter, and we will do everything possible to prevent this from happening again. First, I directed a review of physical security and access procedures at all DoD installations worldwide. The highest responsibilities leaders have is to take care of their people, and our people deserve safe and secure workplaces wherever they are. Second, Deputy Secretary Carter will also lead a review of DoD's practices and procedures for granting and renewing security clearances, including those held by contractors. This review will be closely coordinated with other federal agencies currently examining these procedures, including the DNI and OMB. I've also directed that an independent panel be established. This independent panel will conduct its own assessment of security at DoD facilities and our security clearance procedures and practices. The panel's work will strengthen Secretary Carter's efforts, and they will provide their findings directly to me. The Department of Defense will carefully examine the assessments, the conclusions, and recommendations of these reviews, and we will effectively implement them. As you know, the Navy is also conducting its own review, and those results will feed into the broader DoD review worldwide. Where there are gaps, we will close them. Where there are inadequacies, we will address them. And where there are failures, we will correct them. We owe the victims, their families, and all our people nothing less. Thank you. General Dempsey.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. I also want to add my condolences over Monday's horrific shootings at the Navy Yard. My heart goes out to the families of our fallen, to those injured during the attack, their co-workers, and to the entire Navy family. While I cannot discuss the details of an ongoing investigation, I can discuss the bravery of the first responders. Even in the midst of tragedy, there are moments of triumph. The most visible feats were accomplished by professionals, our military, police, and EMTs, but there were other unseen moments equally heroic. I was especially inspired by the story of Omar Grant, a Navy Yard civilian who helped a blind colleague to safety as they exited Building 197 in the middle of the shooting. Omar refused to leave his friend behind. The urge to run toward danger to help someone in need is a testament to an American's character. Our military family will continue to help those in need. Secretary of the Navy has granted designee status to provide medical care to those injured in the attacks. We've also mobilized teams of military chaplains throughout the area to minister to those in need, and counseling services are available for all of those affected by Monday's rampage. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Leah?
Mr. Secretary, and perhaps Mr. Chairman, if you can answer, to the general public who sees the sort of string of events, Snowden, Hassan, Bradley Manning, and now this, it sort of looks as though there are incidents, there are studies, and something happens again. You did extensive studies after the Hassan incident. So can you talk about what changes were not made then that should have been made? Are there gaps? And when you look at security clearances, should we lower the bar to include more personal information or take note of greater personal information in order to protect safety? Where is that line?
Well, first, obviously, something went wrong. That's the point of the directives that I have made in the reviews that will go forward. As I said in my comments, we will review everything. And from that review, the intensity of that review, the depth and the width of that review, we would hope that we will find some answers to how we do it better. How can we do it better? The fact is, that, starting with the tragedy of what happened Monday, and you mentioned other tragedies, we don't live in a risk-free society. And every day, all the millions of DOD employees, whether they're uniform or civilian, that come to work, help this country, contribute to the security and safety of this country, there's always some risk to that. And that isn't a good answer. That's not good enough. They deserve the security of a safe environment. We will find those gaps, as I said, and we will fix those gaps. So to go beyond that in the specific areas of your questions, I would leave that to the review. There are many questions that are going to be asked, need to be asked, many reviews, and the intensity of those reviews have to go down to every aspect, the security of our physical premises, the security clearance, standards of that security clearance, are they strong enough? Why do we do certain things the way we do? We need answers, and we will find those answers.
Well, I just add that to what the Secretary said. In terms of what we changed after some of those earlier...
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent